Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about identification and authentication of access, especially some of the key concepts, areas, risks, and controls that we should be thinking about it when we're trying to identify someone and authenticate an account. With that, let me share my screen over here. And I have some of the areas, actually all the areas that the CISA exam wants you to know in terms of the controls, areas, risks, and what to think about it from that perspective. The first one, we need to identify the creation and access request. Now, before I go even into all of these ones, remember that all of these ones, identification and authentication, are related to a person's access. So all these things, what we need to think about it is someone have access to a system. Now, how they're going to identify into that system and how they're going to authenticate into that system. But the risk goes further than that. The risk goes to once the person is identified and authenticated into that system, to make sure that the person only have access to what they are supposed to be doing. Depending on what their job roles are, they only need to have that specific access. Is what it's called the least privilege access. Now, when we think about identify creation and access request, that basically means that we need to make sure, and when I say we, is the company needs to make sure that they have enough processes and procedures in place that when someone needs to create and request access, goes through a process that will mitigate the risk that someone have too much access to a system. So some of those areas, it could be that, hey, someone is reviewing what access that person needs to system A or system B or system C. Maybe they have what sometimes is called an RBAC, a role-based access control matrix. And this RBAC will define, depending on the different job descriptions or the different job titles, what type of access they need and which systems do they need access to. So that's a little bit more formalized, a little bit more organized procedures. Sometimes it could be that is less organized, less formalized, where they go directly to their manager and their manager basically approves that access because they know what their job duties are. So they say, hey, this person is coming to do this type of areas, so he needs access to this system with these roles. So that's basically the process that we need to figure out on this first point. The second one is a little bit similar, is transfer request. So what happens with a lot of companies is that the employee is already been working and then has passing the years and he gets promoted and then he gets to manager and let's say later on gets to VP and later on he gets to director, and keeps going into that corporate ladder. Well, what happened if their initial access was never removed? Now, over here, most likely he needs additional access. He will scream out loud to someone in IT saying, hey, I need this access to do my job. And because his job is part to make sure that the company is progressing, someone is going to make sure that he actually have the access that he needs to do now that additional job. But what about the accesses that he used to have and he no longer have it? So if someone who, let's say, started from the bottom, like as a staff or an assistant or an analyst, and they need a lot of transactional level access, but once you're a manager, probably that person don't need those transactions because now they're approving, they are overviewing, they are checking that things are moving the way that they're supposed to be doing rather than inputting transactions. So probably they don't need that access. Now, if that person keeps going up in that ladder and then become like more important positions and their initial access was never removed in the first place, Well, the problem will be that at some point, that person may have access to the entire system, will become a super user. Of course, that will be on the, say, worst case scenario, most likely will never happen, but we always have to think about the worst case scenario to start thinking about more the risk perspective and what are some of the areas that we should be considering. So let's go to the next one. So that means transfer request, making sure that we're not just granting the access that the person needs, but also removing the access that the person no longer needs. Which will go back to the third one, which is access termination request. That happens if someone actually left the company and no longer need that access. So making sure that you are, as an IT person, not the IS auditor, but the IT person is actually removing and terminating the access of that user on a timely basis. Because if the company don't remove that access, let's say a day or two after someone is terminated, and they forget and they say, hey, after 6 months they suddenly remove that access, well, how do you know that that person that is no longer with the company, let's say, went to a competitor or went to another supplier or something similar, could still access your company's data and information, right? So it becomes something a higher risk perspective. Make sure that the company have good procedures in place to terminate those accounts. Now, password communication. How the organization, how the company is communicating passwords to their employees. Whenever they have, for example, a new account created, do they send an email with the password? Do they encrypt it? Do they use a password vault? How do they share passwords whenever a password needs to be shared? Do they share it with a sticky note? Do they share it, like in a password vault? Do they share it by knowledge, just telling each other, hey, this is the password? Definitely you have to make sure that the company have good procedures in place on how they're communicating and managing those passwords, which leads to the next one, which is password management, which in other words we can say also password configurations, which is how the systems are configured to be in alignment with what the company password policies are. So it could be very essential as saying, hey, the company needs a 10 characters minimum password policy on all their systems, so making sure that all their systems are in that configuration. Also, how the employees need to share passwords whenever they need to. Do they share it just on a sticky note, or do they share it using a technology like a password vault? Also, if they're using a password vault, how the master password is being protected, etc. So that's basically password management, making sure that you have good processes in place to protect those passwords, to protect the accounts that are later on going to be identified and authenticated into the system. Policy administration, as you've seen already, there's a lot of policies behind making sure that there are processes in place. But of course, if the policy is faulty by default, the entire process is going to be faulty by default. Let's put it a very not realistic but really good example to explain this point. Let's say that a company's policy, it says that no one needs any type of password configuration. Anyone can have anything that they want. There is no minimum requirement, there is no complexity, and so on. Well, by itself, that policy is already faulty, because if you allow anyone to create any password, 1234 could potentially be a password. Now, it could be that the company is doing a lot of education, making sure that everyone is creating stronger passwords, etc. But the system is not preventing, because by policy, it's not preventing someone trying to use a password that is very trivial, that is very easy to be guessed. So that's where policies, making sure that we review policies and their administration of those ones and what's its content. Validation basically goes back to validate, make sure that accounts are valid, making sure that people who have access to a system are appropriate to have that access. Reinstatement is basically how the company is doing processes to make sure that they're bringing back or reinstating an account. Let's say someone left for a longer period of time, someone is terminated and then come back again to the company, how those procedures are in place. Authorization sub-process is basically how the system is performing an authorization. That's a little bit more on IT perspective. SOD, it comes back to segregation of duties. That's really, really important because we have to make sure that we check for management that they don't have any type of conflicts in terms of access to a system. So let's say, for example, someone have access to post general ledgers. They have access to post those transactions in the general ledger. Well, that's good. But what happens if that same person have also access to approve what has been posted? So a little bit of background if you don't know how a general ledger works. It's not that you can just put the numbers over there into the general ledger and you have, your revenue or your sales or your cost of goods sold or anything that you want to have over there, your profit. It's always going to be reviewed. That's how all GL accounts and systems work. You cannot just post it over there. It's always a post and a review, or sometimes called park. So someone needs to review those transactions to make sure that someone is not just, inflating the numbers and just putting that, hey, yeah, we sold $1 million of something when it actually was only $1,000. Or it could be that sometimes it's just like that. A typo that someone entered an additional zero. So what happens if the person who's posting also have access to review? Well, now it's creating a segregation of duties conflict because that access should be segregated. Two people should be doing one of the accesses, but no person should be doing both. And actually, that's one of the highest risks in any type of companies. If you go to any company, it doesn't matter what type of industry, park and post is one of the highest risk in terms of segregation of duties, because over there is where a lot of fraud could happen. It's directly on the transaction that is going to the financial statements. That's why segregation of duties is very important, making sure that the users have appropriate access to the systems. But it's not just that, making sure that the access that they have to the system is also not conflicting with other accesses too. Log management, making sure that whenever you have any type of logs from the system, that you are managing them correctly. Is a really bad log if it goes to a flat file that everyone have access. Well, someone can just go over there and change the logs and then cover their tracks. That's why you have to make sure that those log files are being stored in a location that are secure and not people have access to modify those logs. Privilege access, that's basically any type of privilege access like administrators, root, sudo, making sure that those are appropriate. Again, remember that we're talking about people, we're talking about what type of access they have. So making sure if they are the administrator of the system, that they actually need that access and they're not conflicting with other type of duties. For example, they are not the developer and also the administrator of the system. Because if that's so, they can make changes in transactions and configurations and they can basically modify those transactions in the production system. So that's where we go back again to SOD. But in privileged access, we just look for who are the administrators and make sure that those are appropriate because they have the keys to the kingdom. They have the keys to do anything in the system. And those are really, really high sensitive areas where usually you will find a very small number of people with that access. Finally, dormant and orphan user accounts. That's a really good way to look if you miss any type of terminations or if someone have access that they shouldn't. And you can find over there because suddenly you find someone have XYZ access that they never used it before. So you can raise the question of how much do that person actually need in terms of access. So again, all of these controls, all of these risks are part of how you not just identify and authenticate an account, but also make sure that they have the correct and appropriate access, because the major risk is that someone have more access than they should. With that, I hope this area will be great for you to go through and have a better understanding. This area is in the last domain, domain number 5. There's a lot of controls, there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of technicalities. Identification and authentication is just one small area of all of that domain. But with that, I hope it was very useful, very informational. And with that, let me know if you have any comments, any questions, or if there's something that I explained and it's not very clear. I will try to re-explain it again. With that, we'll see you on the next video.